They called him the Crown Prince of New York, a man who inherited an empire before he was 30 and never once questioned whether he deserved it. But that night at Hanseong, Seo Jun-Hyuk didn't want loyalty. He wanted entertainment. He looked at the waitress who had just graced his glass, barely a tremor, barely a drop, and let out a low, amused sound that was somehow colder than a shout. The room stilled. He gestured toward the empty stage, where a microphone stood waiting for a performer who had not arrived. "You interrupted my evening," he said, his voice unhurried, almost gentle. "So fix it. Sing something. Sing Casta Diva right now and I'll forget this happened." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of ease. "Or don't. And we'll find another use for the rest of your night." He smirked. He was already bored by the outcome. He didn't know her mother's name. He didn't know what her mother's name meant to the man sitting beside him. He was about to find out. The evening had arrived cold and sharp over Manhattan, a late autumn night that pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hanseong like it had something to prove. To the city, the restaurant was a landmark, a Michelin-starred monument to Korean culinary artistry, perpetually booked, impossible to enter without either a fortune or a reputation. To those who understood the reservation system beneath the reservation system, it was something else entirely. The place where the Seo family conducted the business that never appeared in any filing. Nancy McGowan smoothed the front of her white server's shirt and breathed through her nose. She had been working Hanseong's floor for 4 months, and she had learned the rules the way you learn not to touch a hot stove. Once, fast and permanently. Keep your eyes down. Move efficiently. Do not linger near the private room at the back. Do not look at the man who occupies it. Table 7 needs a wine refill, McGowan. Her floor supervisor, a thin woman named Ms. Park who communicated primarily through suppressed fury, appeared at her shoulder. "And for the love of everything, do not make eye contact with the family table. They're in a mood tonight." Nancy's stomach tightened. The family table. Everyone in the city knew the name Seo Jun-Hyuk, even people who would have preferred not to. He was 29 when his father handed him the keys to the Seo organization. The legal half and the other half, the one that didn't appear in any annual report. He was 32 now, devastatingly composed, with a jawline that looked like it had been designed to deliver disappointing news, and eyes that assessed every room he entered the way a chess player assesses a board. Thoroughly and already several moves ahead. The staff said he had not raised his voice in years. They said this like it was reassuring. It was not reassuring. Nancy McGowan had 2 alarm clocks. The first went off at 5:45, and it belonged to the version of her that took the 7 train to a breakfast diner in Woodside, Queens, where she refilled coffee until her feet ached and the morning regulars called her by name and the tips were small but reliable. The second went off at 3 in the afternoon, and it belonged to the version that ironed her white shirt, tied her bow tie in the bathroom mirror, and took the subway back into Manhattan for the shift she never talked about at the diner. She had been living between these 2 versions of herself for so long that the distance between them had started to feel like a normal commute. The upright piano in her apartment was her mother's. It took up most of the living room and all of the wall it stood against, an old Yamaha with 3 sticky keys and a bench that squeaked when you sat down fast. Gloria McGowan had bought it secondhand when Nancy was 4 years old and had spent the next 14 years teaching her daughter on it. Scales first, then pieces, then the repertoire that most students don't encounter until conservatory. She had been a demanding teacher. Patient but exacting. She never explained where she had learned to teach that way or why she had stopped performing, or what had happened to the career that Nancy found only in fragments. A review here, a program there, a photograph in an old gazette that she had discovered at 22 and not been able to stop thinking about since. The Juilliard application was in the kitchen drawer, beneath a utility bill and a takeout menu. Nancy had filled it out twice. She had printed the final version, sealed it in an envelope and walked it to the post office on a Tuesday morning in October 2 years ago, and then stood at the drop slot for 4 minutes and walked home with it still in her hand. She told herself it was timing. She told herself it was money. She was not entirely sure she was telling herself the truth. The envelope was still in the drawer. She had not thrown it away. Hanseong felt different the moment you came in through the staff entrance. The dining room from the front was warm and golden, candlelight and lacquered wood and the low hum of expensive conversation. From the back it was a system under pressure. The kitchen running at controlled fury, the floor staff moving with the particular precision of people who understood that a mistake here was not the kind of mistake you were written up for. You learned the atmosphere fast or you didn't come back. You learned Ms. Park's silences, which ones meant correction was coming and which ones meant she had already decided you were beyond it. You learned which tables required a lighter pour and which required you to fill without being asked and disappear before you were noticed. You learned, above everything, the specific quality of stillness that fell over the floor when the family arrived. It was not fear exactly. It was the thing that lives just underneath fear, that sharp attentiveness that the body produces when it understands without needing to be told that the normal rules of consequence have been suspended. Nancy had felt it for the first time on her third shift. She had looked up from a table she was clearing and seen the staff simply reorganize, quietly, fluidly, like water moving around a stone, and known, before anyone said a name, that someone had arrived who rearranged the room by being in it. She hadn't seen him yet. She hadn't needed to. The microphone stand was center stage, the spotlight still warm from a performer who was never going to use it. Nancy walked toward it the way you walk toward something that frightens you, without slowing down, because slowing down is how the fear wins. The room watched. She could feel it. The particular quality of attention that a crowd produces when it doesn't yet know whether it is about to be impressed or entertained by failure. Jun-Hyuk's table had gone quiet. Behind her she was aware of the bodyguards, the guests, the suspended silverware. Miss Park somewhere near the service door, probably calculating how many ways this ended her career. Nancy closed her hand around the microphone and closed her eyes. Her mother's voice came to her the way it always did when she needed it. Not as a memory exactly, but as a presence. Breathe from the floor of yourself, Gloria used to say, standing beside the old Yamaha with her arms crossed and her eyes precise. Not from your chest. Not from your throat. From the place that doesn't panic. She had said it 100 times. She had said it the way people say things they know from the inside out, from having once needed to be told themselves. Nancy breathed from the floor of herself. And then she began. The first note of Casta Diva does not ask for the room's attention. It simply arrives and makes all other sound impossible. It is a high, sustained opening that requires a soprano to commit completely. There is no easing into it, no approaching from safety. You either have it or you announce in a single instant that you don't. Nancy had it. The note filled the dining room of Hanseong the way light fills a space when a door is opened, completely and from everywhere at once. Several people turned involuntarily, the way you turn toward sudden weather. A woman near the window set down her fork without seeming to notice she had done it. Nancy didn't open her eyes. She didn't need the room. She had her mother's voice in her ear and 20 years of practice in her body, and every morning she had spent at that sticky-keyed piano instead of sleeping, and she poured all of it into Bellini's prayer. The high priestess pleading to the moon, her power enormous, her secret unbearable, her voice the only place she was allowed to be entirely herself. The aria climbed. Nancy climbed with it, through the long sustained phrases, through the ornamentation that lesser sopranos simplified and she did not, through the final soaring passage that her mother had made her repeat until she could hear it was right before she could explain why. When the last note resolved and the silence arrived, it was a different silence than the one before. Heavier. Altered. Nancy opened her eyes. Jun-Hyuk was no longer leaning back. He had come forward in his chair without seeming to notice, his elbows on the table, the easy confidence of his posture dissolved into something that had no name yet. The smirk was gone. In its place was an expression she didn't have a word for, unguarded, almost young, the face of a man who has been caught off guard by something he didn't know he was capable of feeling. She might have stayed on him. But a sound pulled her gaze sideways. Crystal on marble. Seo Dongchul's wine glass lay on its side, the red spreading slowly across the white tablecloth. The old man had not moved to catch it. He was staring at her, not with surprise, not with the polite shock of an audience member unexpectedly moved. With recognition. With something that looked unmistakably like the face of a man who has just seen the past walk into the room and open its mouth. Nancy held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then the room erupted and she made herself look away. The applause was still settling when Jun-Hyuk stood up. He didn't signal his men or consult the room. He simply rose the way people rise when they've decided something, and crossed to the edge of the stage in a few unhurried strides. The crowd parted for him without being asked. Nancy was still at the microphone, her pulse coming down, her hands finding their stillness again after the trembling she never let reach the surface. He stopped a few feet from her and looked up. She looked back. She had decided, somewhere in the final bars of the aria, that she was done angling her eyes at the floor. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice had lost the performative ease from earlier, the tone he'd used to issue the dare, smooth and slightly bored. What replaced it was quieter and somehow more unsettling. "Yes," Nancy said. He considered that. "Where?" "My mother's living room, mostly." Something moved briefly across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite respect. Something in between that he seemed to decide against showing fully. "What's your name?" "McGowan," she said. "Nancy McGowan." She watched it travel across the room before she watched his face. A reflex she hadn't known she had. Her eyes went to Dongchul first, because something in the back of her mind had been tracking the old man since the glass fell, cataloging him the way you catalog a sound you can't yet identify. He saw it happen. It was not dramatic. That was what made it impossible to dismiss. Dongchul did not flinch or look away or reach for the composure men like him keep on hand for unexpected situations. He simply went still. A different quality of stillness than before, not the controlled stillness of authority but the absolute stillness of a man whose body has received information that his mind has not yet finished processing. His eyes stayed on her. His expression did not change. That was the tell. That nothing changed. Nancy filed it. Precisely, carefully, the way her mother had taught her to hear a wrong note. Not reacting, just registering, storing it somewhere that wouldn't be disturbed. Jun-Hyuk was still watching her. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a card, black with silver lettering, the kind of card that exists less to convey information than to convey the kind of person who gives you this card. He held it out. "I'll want to know who taught you," he said. Nancy looked at the card for a moment before she took it. His name. A number. Nothing else. The economy of a man who assumes context fills itself in. "My mother taught me," she said. "Then she was extraordinary." "Yes," Nancy said. "She was." She slipped the card into her apron pocket and stepped down from the stage, and Jun-Hyuk watched her go with that same unreadable expression, and the room began to breathe again around them, and none of it, not his attention, not the card, not the quiet approval in his voice, was the reason she had taken it. She had taken it because of the old man's stillness. Because of the way his eyes had moved to her face when she said her name and then stayed there, performing neutrality with the careful effort of someone who has had 20 years of practice. Because a secret that old, sitting that close to the surface, meant there was something underneath it. And Nancy McGowan had her mother's ear. She knew when a note was wrong exactly where to press. She started with what she had, which wasn't much. A name that made an old man go still. A dropped glass. 20 years of her mother's silence, which Nancy had always read as shame and was beginning to suspect was something else entirely. Not the silence of a woman who had failed, but the silence of a woman who had been warned. She sat at the kitchen table after her morning shift with her laptop and a cold cup of coffee and began the way you begin when you don't know what you're looking for. Carefully and from a long way back. Gloria McGowan had been, briefly, extraordinary. The record of it was scattered and thin. A few archived review pages, a conservatory listing, a photograph in a scan program from a 2001 benefit concert where she was third billed but the only name the reviewer mentioned by name. A voice of uncommon maturity, the review said. "Watch this one." Nancy had found that line 2 years ago and read it so many times the phrasing had worn smooth in her memory. She had never found much else. The reviews stopped. The listings stopped. By late 2003, Gloria McGowan had simply ceased to exist as a public figure, as though someone had drawn a clean line across her name and said, "Here is where this ends." Nancy had always believed that line was drawn by circumstance. By the pregnancy, by the money running out, by the choices that closed around a woman alone in a city that moved on without her. She searched differently now. She searched the Seo family's public history, the legitimate side, the one with press releases and charity galas and foundation announcements. It took her 40 minutes to find it, and when she did, she sat very still for a long moment. A photograph. Scanned from what looked like a society column, the image grainy with age. A fundraising gala, October 2003, hosted by Seo Cultural Investments. A name she had never heard, a subsidiary that no longer appeared in any current filing. There were 12 people in the photograph, standing in front of a stepped arrangement of flowers. Most of them were unfamiliar. One of them was Seo Dongchul, 30 years younger, his hair still dark, his expression the same careful neutrality she had catalogued at the family table 2 nights ago. And there, at the left edge of the frame, half turned toward someone outside the photograph's boundary, wearing a dark dress and the particular posture of a person who has just been told something and hasn't decided yet how to respond. Her mother, Gloria McGowan, 3 months before she stopped singing. At a Seo event. Looking at something Nancy couldn't see. Nancy closed the laptop and sat with it. Then she opened the kitchen drawer, moved the utility bill and found the black card with the silver lettering. She turned it over once. She was not naive about what calling this number meant, what kind of world she was asking to be let into and what the cost of admission might be. She had worked 4 months in that building. She understood what the private room was for. But the photograph was dated October 2003. Her mother had gone silent by January 2004. And Seo Dong-chul had stood in that same frame with her, and 20 years later had dropped his wine glass at the sound of her daughter's voice. Nancy picked up her phone. He answered on the second ring as though he had been expecting it, which she suspected with a man like that, was probably true. "It's Nancy McGowan," she said. "I'd like to talk about my mother." Pause. Brief but not nothing. "I know," he said. She had chosen the diner deliberately. Not Hanseong's neighborhood, not Manhattan at all. A booth in a woodside diner on a Tuesday afternoon, fluorescent lighting and laminated menus and the particular democracy of a place where no one was performing anything for anyone. If he was going to be uncomfortable, she wanted it to be on her terms. If he wasn't, she wanted to know that too. He arrived exactly on time, which told her something. He had left the bodyguards outside, which told her more. He looked different without the private room around him. The tailored suit was still there, the composed authority still present in the way he moved through a space, but without the candlelight and the dangerous atmosphere of Hanseong arranging itself around him. He was simply a man in a diner who was slightly too well dressed for the occasion and seemed, to his apparent credit, entirely unbothered by it. He slid into the booth across from her, glanced once at the menu and set it down. "You said you wanted to talk about your mother," he said. "I do," Nancy said. "But first I want to know what you already know." He looked at her steadily. "What makes you think I know anything?" "You answered the phone and said, 'I know' before I finished my sentence." Pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not discomfort, but the particular recalibration of a man who has been caught being careless and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. That could have meant several things. "It could have," Nancy said. "What did it mean?" He was quiet for a moment. The waitress came and filled their coffee cups and left without either of them noticing. Then Jun-Hyuk said, "My father recognized your name. I saw it happen. I've been trying to understand it since." It was more than she had expected. She filed that too. The fact that he had offered it without being pressed further. The fact that whatever his father's silence meant to him, he wasn't automatically defending it. "Tell me about 2003, she said. "The Cultural Foundation. The gala your father hosted. I was 9 years old in 2003. Tell me what you know now." So he talked and she listened, and the coffee got refilled twice. He told her what he knew of his father's early ambitions. The drive to build something that looked legitimate from every angle, the cultural investments that were meant to function as both genuine philanthropy and social architecture, the carefully curated events that put Dong-chul in rooms with the kind of people whose proximity conferred credibility. He spoke about his inheritance the way someone speaks about a house they grew up in, knowing every room, never having chosen it. Nancy noticed that he did not once ask her to be careful with what she did with the information. She noticed that he watched her face while he spoke with a focused attention that was not uncomfortable, exactly, just present in a way she hadn't expected. 2 hours passed the way time passes when a conversation has weight to it, faster than it should. She was pulling on her jacket when she saw him. A man at the counter, middle-aged, unremarkable in every deliberate way, his phone angled slightly wrong for someone who was only checking his messages. She had learned at Hanseong to notice the people who were trying not to be noticed. She looked at Jun-Hyuk. He had seen it too. His jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yours?" she asked. "My father's," he said. And something in his voice had changed. Flatter, colder, the voice of a man recalculating the distance between himself and an inheritance he had never questioned until now. The summons came the following morning. Not a call, not a message, but a car outside Nancy's building at 7 a.m. that Jun-Hyuk had not sent. He recognized the plates when his own phone rang 20 minutes later. "Come to the house," his father said. Alone. The Seo family home in Riverdale was the kind of house that had been chosen for what it communicated rather than what it felt like to live in. Large without being ostentatious. Secure without appearing fortified. Dong-chul was in the study when Jun-Hyuk arrived, standing at the window with his hands behind his back, a posture Jun-Hyuk had understood since childhood to mean that the conversation had already been decided. "Sit down," his father said without turning. Jun-Hyuk remained standing. Pause. Dong-chul turned then and looked at his son with the measured expression he deployed when something had surprised him and he had chosen not to let it show fully. He looked older in the morning light, Jun-Hyuk thought. Or perhaps he was simply looking more carefully than he usually allowed himself to. "The McGowan girl," his father said. "You're asking questions." "I'm having a conversation." "You're being photographed having a conversation." "In Queens." "In a diner." The word carried the faint weight of a man for whom Queens represented a category of error. It creates an impression. Of what? Of complication. Dong-chul moved to the desk, adjusted a paperweight that didn't need adjusting. "There are things in the past that are better left arranged as they are. Old business. She is connected to it in ways she doesn't fully understand, and your involvement will not clarify anything. It will only disturb it." Jun-Hyuk was quiet for a moment. He had sat across from his father in this room for 32 years. He had listened to assessments delivered in this same tone. Reasonable, final, the tone of a man explaining how things work to someone who should by now already know. He had always, eventually, accepted the frame. "What did you do?" Jun-Hyuk asked. The room held the question. Dong-chul looked at him with something that moved briefly beneath the surface of his face before being smoothed back down. "I protected what we built," he said. "The way I have always protected it. The way you have benefited from your entire life." "That's not an answer. It is the only answer you need." His father held his gaze, steady, certain, the full authority of the man who had built everything Jun-Hyuk stood on. "Leave it alone, Jun-Hyuk. Leave her alone. This is not a thread you want to pull." Jun-Hyuk left without responding. It was the first time he had done that. The envelope was on the floor when Nancy got home from her morning shift, slid beneath the door with the clean precision of someone who had done it quickly and without hesitation. No name on the front. She knew before she opened it that she wasn't going to like what was inside. A photograph. Her mother. Younger, maybe 30, standing outside a building Nancy didn't recognize, laughing at something outside the frame. It was a candid, the kind you take without the subject knowing. The kind that means I was close enough to take this. Beneath it, a strip of paper. 4 words handwritten in careful block letters. "Stop asking. Walk away." Nancy stood in her doorway for a long moment. Then she went inside, set the photograph on top of the Juilliard envelope in the kitchen drawer and picked up her phone. She called Jun-Hyuk. He answered before the second ring. "I got a message," she said. "From your father, I think." A silence. Shorter than the last one. "So did I," he said. He came for her at noon on a Thursday, when Dong-chul was at a board meeting in Midtown that Jun-Hyuk had confirmed would run until 3. 2 hours, he told her. Maybe less. She wore her plainest clothes and didn't ask how he had a key to his father's archive room, because she suspected the answer was complicated and they didn't have time for it. The compound's lower level was cooler than the floors above. The specific coolness of a space that is climate-controlled for the preservation of documents rather than the comfort of people. Jun-Hyuk moved through it with the efficiency of someone who knew the layout without having spent much time there. He found the room at the end of a corridor, unlocked it and held the door. Nancy went in first. The files were organized by year. That was the first thing she noticed. The meticulous, decade-long order of them, the labeled tabs in the archival boxes and the handwriting on the spines that was small and precise and immediately recognizable as the handwriting of a man who trusted no one else to do this correctly. Dong-chul had kept everything. That was either confidence or compulsion, and standing in the room it produced, Nancy couldn't tell which. Jun-Hyuk found 2003 within minutes. He pulled the box and set it on the table without a word, and they went through it together, standing side by side in the low light. The financial records came first. The gala's funding structure, the donor ledger, the subsidiary accounts that fed into the event's operating costs. Nancy photographed each page steadily. Then Jun-Hyuk turned to a section separated from the others by a plain manila folder and opened it and went still. She looked. Memos. 6 of them, dated between October and December 2003, addressed to men whose names she didn't recognize with the exception of one. A conservatory administrator whose signature also appeared on the letter her mother had received that December, the one informing her that her contract had been reviewed and would not be renewed. There were call logs. There was a list of venues with notations beside each, a single word in the same small precise handwriting. Advised. There was a letter, 3 paragraphs in Dong-chul's hand. Jun-Hyuk read it. She watched him read it. She watched him reach the second paragraph and stop and read it again, and she knew from the set of his jaw that the second paragraph was the one that could not be contextualized or explained away or filed under the protective category of what had to be done. He didn't look at her when he finished. He set the letter down carefully with the deliberate gentleness of someone managing an impulse, and put both hands flat on the table. The silence in the room was the kind that asks something of you. Nancy didn't plan it. It came the way things come when the body understands something before the mind has finished with it. A sound, low and quiet, the first few bars of the lullaby her mother had hummed at the piano's end. In the evenings when the lesson was finished and they were just the two of them in the apartment, and Gloria would sometimes close her eyes and hum something she never named or explained. Nancy hadn't known she was going to do it until it was already happening. She didn't sing long. Just the phrase once through, barely above a breath. When it stopped, Jun-Hyuk's hands were still flat on the table. He hadn't moved. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. But something in the room had shifted quietly and permanently, in the way that certain things shift. Not with a sound but with the absolute quality of a door that has just been opened from the inside. Neither of them acknowledged it. They photographed the rest of the files in silence and left before 2 o'clock, and on the drive back to Queens neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was entirely different from the silence that had been there before. Jun-Hyuk waited until the following evening. He wanted to be certain, not of the facts which were no longer in question but of himself. Of what he was going to say and whether he was going to mean it all the way through, because he had watched his father end conversations his entire life by simply being more certain than the other person, and he did not intend to give him that. He put the letter on the desk between them. The original, not a photograph. Dong-chul looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he sat back and the expression on his face was not the one Jun-Hyuk had prepared for. It was not defensiveness or calculation or the controlled neutrality he deployed in difficult rooms. It was something quieter and, in its way, worse. The expression of a man who has known this moment was coming and has simply been waiting to see which direction it arrived from. You went into the archive, his father said. You destroyed her career, Jun-Hyuk said. Deliberately. Systematically. You made calls to people who owed you and you had her removed from every room she was about to walk into. And then you let her disappear and called it resolved. I protected the organization. From a soprano. From exposure. His father's voice was even. She had seen the subsidiary accounts. She understood what they were funding. She was going to take that information to people who would have used it to take everything we had built. Everything you have spent your life benefiting from. I made a decision. The kind of decision that kept this family intact. You took her voice. I left her alive. Dong-chul said it without emphasis, which was the most terrible way to say it. In my world at that time that was a considerable restraint. Jun-Hyuk looked at his father and understood, with a clarity that arrived without drama, that this was the inheritance. Not the shipping empire, not the accounts, not the buildings. The architecture of justification that his father had built so carefully over so many years that he had stopped being able to see it as architecture at all. It had become to him simply the shape of the world. I won't defend it, Jun-Hyuk said. And I won't protect it. Dong-chul looked at his son for a long moment. You don't know what you're saying. I do, Jun-Hyuk said. Finally. Nancy had found them through the labor rights organization that had been quietly documenting the subsidiary network for years without enough corroboration to go public. She had 3 conversations in a church hall in Flushing with people who had been waiting a very long time for someone to arrive with the kind of documentation she was carrying. He gave them everything, the memos, the call logs, the ledger, the letter. He kept nothing back. The story ran on a Thursday morning. By noon it had moved beyond the business press into the city's broader conversation. By evening, Seo Dongchul's foundation had suspended operations pending review. Two of the men named in the memos had retained lawyers, and a conservatory administrator had issued a statement acknowledging that certain decisions made in 2003 were being re-examined. Nancy read it at the kitchen table beside her cold coffee with her mother's photograph in front of her. The candid one from the envelope, Gloria laughing at something outside the frame. She thought about what her mother had known and what it had cost her to know it and what it meant that she had kept teaching anyway. Had kept pouring everything she had into a daughter's voice. She had protected the only way left to her. Nancy closed her laptop. She reached into the drawer and took out the Juilliard envelope. This time she put on her coat and walked to the post office and didn't stop. The gala had been reconstituted under a new board and a new name. The old Seo Cultural Investments letterhead replaced by something that had no family's name attached to it at all. The venue was the same. A concert hall on the Upper West Side with good acoustics and a stage that had been waiting without knowing it for 20 years to host the performance it was always supposed to have. Nancy stood in the wings and listened to the room fill. She had been here for an hour already, longer than she needed to be, because she had wanted to be alone with the stage before anyone else arrived. She had stood at its edge in the empty hall and looked out at the seats and thought about her mother standing somewhere like this. In a wing, in a corridor, in the specific suspension of the moments before. And she had not felt grief, exactly. Something more complicated. Something that had grief in it but also gratitude, and something else she didn't have a clean word for, which was the feeling of carrying a person forward into a room they were never allowed to enter. The program was a single folded card, clean and unadorned. She had written the dedication herself, in the same careful block letters her mother had used to mark her sheet music. Gloria McGowan, who gave her voice so her daughter could keep hers. The hall was full now. She could hear it in the quality of the sound coming through the curtain. The particular density of a room that has reached capacity, the layered murmur of people settling into the expectation of something. Somewhere in the third row were the women from the Flushing Church Hall, the ones who had waited years for a Thursday morning newspaper. Somewhere near the back was Ms. Park, who had called Nancy 2 weeks ago formally and briefly to say she would attend, which Nancy understood to be the closest thing to an apology she was likely to receive and accepted it as such. And in the front row, in the seat she had not assigned him but had known he would find, was Jun-Hyuk. She had seen him briefly in the lobby an hour ago before she came backstage. He was not wearing the tailored armor of the man at the family table. He was wearing something quieter, and he had looked at her with the expression she had first seen on his face the night the lullaby moved through the archive room and changed the air between them. Unguarded, present, the face of someone who has decided to stop managing the distance. They hadn't said much. There wasn't much that needed saying yet. There would be time for the rest of it. The conductor appeared at the edge of her vision, a small nod. Her cue. Nancy straightened her shoulders and walked out. The spotlight found her and she let it. She stood at the microphone and looked out at the full hall and did not look away, and she thought, this is her room. I am bringing her into it. Then she breathed from the floor of herself, the way Gloria had taught her, and she began. Casta Diva opened the same way it always opened. With the note that doesn't ask permission, that simply arrives and makes all other sound impossible. She had sung it in a room full of dangerous men to survive. She sang it now for a different reason, and the difference was in every phrase of it, and the room felt that difference without being able to name it and went very still. She sang it all the way through. She did not rush the ornamentation or simplify the phrases that asked the most of her. She sang it the way her mother had taught her to sing everything, as though the music deserved the full truth of what you had to give it, and not one note less. When the final phrase resolved and the silence arrived, it was the longest silence she had ever stood inside. Then someone in the front row stood up. Jun-Hyuk was on his feet before the applause began, and he was not clapping the way people clap when they are moved. He was standing the way people stand when they are witnessing something they understand they will carry with them, still and straight and entirely present. The rest of the hall rose around him and the sound filled the room, and Nancy stood in her mother's spotlight and let it.